Welcome to History Recapped, where we explore the greatest moments in human history. Today we turn to one of the most extraordinary stories ever told, the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. In just a few decades, nomadic horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia forged the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. This is a story of conquest and bloodshed, but also of innovation, trade and cultural exchange. It is the story of how Genghis Khan and his descendants reshaped the world. This is the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. Our journey begins on the vast Eurasian steppe in the late 12th century. It was a land of harsh winters, open grasslands and endless horizons. Here survival depended on horses, herds and the strength of clans. Rival tribes competed constantly for pasture and power. Out of this chaotic world was born a boy named Temüjin around the year 1162. His early life was marked by hardship. His father, a minor chief, was poisoned by rivals when Temüjin was still a child. Left without protection, his family was cast out, forced to survive in poverty and isolation. But the young Temüjin proved resourceful and ambitious. He learned the ways of the steppe, how to ride from dawn to dusk, how to hunt, how to endure hunger and cold. He also understood the importance of alliances. Slowly he began to gather a following, binding men to him not through tribal loyalty but through merit and personal loyalty. This was radical in a world where kinship usually determined status. Temüjin's rise was anything but smooth. He was captured by enemies and enslaved for a time, only to escape. He endured betrayal and exile, but each setback only hardened his resolve. Over the years, he forged alliances with powerful steppe leaders, most notably Togrul, the Khan of the Khanates, who acted as a mentor for a time. Through battles, strategy and sheer determination, Temüjin expanded his following. By the year 1206, his efforts culminated in a gathering of tribal leaders on the banks of the Onon River. There, Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. With this title, he stood not just as the chief of one tribe, but as the leader of a newly unified Mongol nation. For the first time, the fractious clans of the steppe had been brought together under a single banner. What made Genghis Khan so formidable was not only his charisma, but his military genius. He organized his army with ruthless efficiency, breaking traditional tribal divisions. His forces were structured into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands, known as tumens. Leaders were chosen based on ability, not birth. Discipline was strict and loyalty absolute. Every soldier was a skilled horseman, capable of riding for days and striking with deadly precision. Their weapon of choice, the composite bow, could pierce armor at range. The Mongols perfected the use of speed, mobility, and deception. They could feign retreat, luring enemies into ambushes. They could strike deep into enemy territory with devastating raids. And above all, they were relentless. Where other armies might crumble after defeat, the Mongols regrouped, learned, and returned stronger. Genghis Khan wasted no time in turning his new power outward. His first great campaigns were against neighboring steppe peoples and the rich kingdoms of northern China. The Mongols waged brutal wars against the Jin dynasty, breaching their fortresses and ravaging their lands. Genghis used siege engineers captured from conquered peoples to batter down city walls. He combined steppe warfare with advanced military technologies, adapting and learning with each campaign. But it was not only China that would feel the Mongol storm. Genghis Khan soon turned westward, striking against the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia. This campaign began with an act of betrayal. Genghis had sent a caravan of merchants to trade, but the governor of a Khwarezmian city seized the goods and killed the envoys. When Genghis sent ambassadors to demand justice, one was killed and the others mutilated. Enraged, he unleashed the full fury of the Mongols. What followed was one of the most devastating campaigns in history. The Mongols swept through Central Asia, destroying cities like Bukhara, Samarkand and Nishapur. Accounts describe rivers of blood, entire populations massacred or enslaved. Yet Genghis Khan also encouraged trade and spared those who submitted peacefully. He valued craftsmen, engineers and scholars, relocating them across the empire to serve his purposes. By the time of his death in 1227, Genghis Khan had carved out an empire stretching from the Pacific shores of China to the Caspian Sea. He had broken kingdoms, shattered armies, and left a legacy of terror, but also of order and vision. The Mongol Empire was still young, but under his successors it would expand even further, reaching the very edges of Europe. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left behind not only the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point, but also a question: who would rule after him? Unlike many conquerors, Genghis had thought carefully about succession. He divided his domains among his sons, but the supreme title of Great Khan went to his third son, Ogedai. This decision reflected Genghis's pragmatism. Ogedai was not the most brilliant of his sons, but he was considered steady, capable and respected by the Mongol elite. Ogedai Khan assumed leadership in 1229. His reign marked the beginning of the Mongol Empire's second great wave of expansion. The Mongols, already feared across Asia, now turned their gaze even further afield. In China, Ogedai pressed the war against the Jin dynasty, determined to complete his father's unfinished conquest. Mongol armies captured city after city, employing brutal efficiency. In 1234, the Jin dynasty collapsed, its last emperor defeated and its lands absorbed into the Mongol realm. The conquest of northern China gave the Mongols immense wealth and resources, but also revealed the challenges of governing vast urban populations. The nomadic conquerors relied heavily on Chinese administrators, engineers and siege specialists to manage their new domains. Meanwhile, the Mongols advanced westward. In the 1230s, they launched campaigns into Persia, the Caucasus and beyond. These conquests brought them into contact with new peoples: Armenians, Georgians and the remnants of Islamic dynasties struggling to hold power. City after city fell before their onslaught. The Mongols demanded absolute submission. Resistance was met with annihilation. Word of their cruelty spread like wildfire, sowing terror long before their armies arrived. The most dramatic expansion came in Eastern Europe. In the late 1230s, a Mongol army under the leadership of Batu, grandson of Genghis Khan, swept into the Russian principalities. Cities like Ryazan, Vladimir and Kiev were besieged and burned. Chronicles describe walls reduced to rubble and streets littered with corpses. The devastation was immense, and Russia would live under Mongol domination, the so-called Mongol yoke, for over 2 centuries. From Russia, the Mongols pushed further west. In 1241, they invaded Hungary and Poland. At the Battle of Legnica, a coalition of European knights was crushed by Mongol cavalry. Soon after, at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, the Mongols delivered another devastating defeat, encircling and destroying much of the Hungarian army. Europe trembled in fear. Rumors spread that nothing could stop the Mongols, that Christendom itself might soon fall. But then, suddenly, the Mongols withdrew. Just as they seemed poised to advance deeper into Europe, word arrived that Ogedai Khan had died in 1241. Following Mongol tradition, the princes returned to the steppe to elect a new Great Khan. Europe had been spared, not by victory but by fate. Still, the memory of the Mongol invasions lingered as a haunting reminder of how vulnerable even the strongest kingdoms could be before the storm from the east. The succession crisis revealed the challenges of ruling such a vast empire. After Ogedai's death, factions among Genghis Khan's descendants vied for supremacy. Eventually, Ogedai's son Guyuk was elected, but his reign was short and troubled. The real stability came under Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis, who became Great Khan in 1251. Mongol reinvigorated the empire, launching campaigns on multiple fronts. Under Mongol's command, the Mongols struck at the Middle East. In 1258, the forces of Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, descended on Baghdad, then the heart of the Islamic world. The siege was brutal. The city's walls were breached and the population massacred. The great libraries of Baghdad, famed for centuries of knowledge, were destroyed. Chroniclers wrote that the Tigris River ran black with ink and red with blood. The fall of Baghdad ended the Abbasid Caliphate, a shock felt across the Muslim world. While Hulagu devastated the Middle East, other Mongol forces turned again toward China, this time against the powerful Song dynasty in the south. The Song were wealthier and more sophisticated than the Jin, with advanced fortifications and a strong economy. Yet the Mongols, with their relentless adaptability, pushed forward. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was at its zenith. It stretched from Korea and China in the east to the plains of Hungary in the west, from the steppes of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. Never before had such a vast and diverse territory been united under a single power. And yet beneath this outward strength, cracks were beginning to show. The empire was held together by the personal authority of the great Khan, but succession disputes and rivalries among Genghis Khan's descendants threatened to tear it apart. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched further than any realm before it, but its unity was fragile. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 plunged the empire into another succession struggle. Rival factions rallied behind different candidates, and once again the stability of the empire was threatened. Out of this turmoil emerged one of the most famous Mongol rulers, Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai was different from many of his steppe-born kin. Raised among both Mongol and Chinese traditions, he appreciated the sophistication of Chinese culture and sought to fuse it with his own heritage. While his brothers and cousins fought bitterly over succession, Kublai consolidated his position in northern China. In 1260, he was declared Great Khan, though rival claimants contested his authority. In truth, the vast empire was now fracturing, but Kublai would make his branch of the dynasty the most powerful of them all. Kublai's greatest achievement was the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. The Song were wealthy, with advanced technology, strong cities and powerful fleets. The Mongols adapted yet again, employing Chinese engineers, naval forces and sophisticated siege weapons. The war was long and brutal, lasting decades. Finally, in 1279, the last Song resistance was crushed at the Battle of Yuan, where the Song fleet was destroyed and the young emperor drowned rather than be captured. For the first time in centuries, all of China was unified under one ruler, Kublai Khan. With this victory, Kublai established the Yuan dynasty, proclaiming himself Emperor of China. Unlike his forebears, who ruled largely as nomadic conquerors, Kublai embraced the role of a Chinese emperor. He moved his capital to Khanbalik, the city that would become Beijing, and built a grand court blending Mongol and Chinese traditions. He supported the arts, trade and science, and welcomed foreign travelers, most famously the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who later described Kublai's empire in glowing terms. Kublai's reign marked the high point of Mongol power and influence. The empire facilitated unprecedented cultural and commercial exchange across Eurasia. The Silk Roads thrived under Mongol protection, with merchants traveling from Europe to China in relative safety. Technologies, ideas and goods flowed more freely than ever before. Gunpowder, paper, printing and even pasta and textiles traveled vast distances, shaping the future of civilizations across continents. Yet even at its height, the empire's limits were clear. Kublai sought to extend Mongol rule beyond China into new frontiers, but not all of his campaigns succeeded. Twice in 1274 and 1281, he launched massive invasions of Japan. Thousands of ships carried Mongol, Chinese and Korean troops across the sea. The Japanese fought fiercely, and both times the invasions were undone by powerful storms that smashed the Mongol fleets. The Japanese called these winds kamikaze, divine winds, believing they had been protected by the gods. The defeats were a reminder that Mongol power was not invincible. Kublai also launched campaigns into Southeast Asia against Vietnam and Java. While the Mongols inflicted damage, they struggled against the jungles, tropical diseases and guerrilla tactics of their enemies. These expeditions drained resources and highlighted the difficulties of projecting steppe warfare into unfamiliar environments. Despite these setbacks, Kublai's Yuan dynasty represented the pinnacle of Mongol imperial grandeur. But it was also a turning point. The very act of becoming Emperor of China marked a shift from nomadic conquest to settled rule. Many Mongols resented this transformation, seeing Kublai as too Chinese, too distant from the traditions of the steppe. Meanwhile, across the empire, regional khanates in Russia, Central Asia and the Middle East increasingly operated as independent powers, loyal in name to the Great Khan, but in practice pursuing their own agendas. By the time of Kublai's death in 1294, the Mongol Empire was no longer a unified whole. It had split into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. Each claimed descent from Genghis Khan, but each followed its own path. The age of a single Mongol empire was over, replaced by a family of states linked by heritage but divided by distance, culture and ambition. After the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, the Mongol Empire entered a period of fragmentation. Though still vast and influential, it no longer functioned as a single unified realm. Instead, it had become a patchwork of semi-independent khanates, each ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants. These khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia, carried on the Mongol legacy, but each faced its own challenges. In Persia, the Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu Khan, flourished at first. Its rulers adopted many aspects of Persian culture and governance, blending Mongol traditions with Islamic civilization. The Ilkhans oversaw a renaissance of art, architecture and scholarship, yet their power was fragile. The Ilkhanate was heavily dependent on trade, and when the economy faltered, so too did the state. Dynastic disputes and the devastating impact of the Black Death in the mid-14th century weakened it further. By the 1350s, the Ilkhanate collapsed into a patchwork of smaller states, its legacy absorbed into the Persian world it had once conquered. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate followed a similar trajectory. Initially strong, it suffered from constant internal rivalries between nomadic traditions and the influence of settled Islamic culture. Without a consistent leader, the Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves. It remained a power on the steppe, but it lacked the strength to dominate as its forefathers had. Eventually, it was overshadowed by new rising powers, including the Timurid Empire in the late 14th century. In Russia, the Golden Horde established by Batu Khan remained formidable for longer. From its base along the Volga River, it ruled over the Russian principalities through a system of tribute. Russian princes were forced to acknowledge Mongol overlordship, their authority dependent on charters issued by the Khans. For 2 centuries, the Golden Horde extracted wealth and maintained dominance, yet even here unity proved elusive. Civil wars broke out among rival claimants to the throne, and as power fractured, subject peoples began to resist. By the late 15th century, Moscow had risen to prominence, rallying resistance to Mongol rule. In 1480, the standoff at the Ugra River symbolized the end of Mongol dominance in Russia, as Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, refused to pay tribute. The Golden Horde's power faded, remembered as both a burden and a catalyst for Russian unification. In China, the Yuan dynasty, the jewel of the Mongol Empire, faced mounting challenges. Kublai Khan's successors lacked his vision and authority. Court corruption grew rampant, taxes rose and natural disasters struck. The Mongols, seen as foreign rulers by the Chinese majority, faced growing resentment. Rebellions flared, fueled by famine, disease and injustice. In the mid-14th century, the most significant of these uprisings was the Red Turban Rebellion, a massive popular movement that swept across China. The Yuan dynasty struggled to contain the chaos. By 1368, the rebels had captured Beijing and the Mongols were driven out of China. The victorious rebel leader, Zhu Yuanzhang, founded the Ming dynasty, marking the end of Mongol rule in East Asia. The Yuan rulers retreated to their steppe homeland, where they became known as the Northern Yuan, clinging to fragments of power but never regaining their former glory. Even as the khanates declined, the Mongols left an indelible mark on history. Their empire had redrawn the map of Eurasia, toppling ancient dynasties, devastating cities and spreading terror. But it had also fostered unprecedented connectivity. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, allowed merchants, envoys and scholars to travel across the vast continent with a safety unknown for centuries. Ideas, inventions and goods flowed along the Silk Roads with a vitality that transformed both East and West. The Mongols had spread paper, printing, gunpowder and the compass, technologies that would shape the modern world. Yet the very scale of their empire contained the seeds of its downfall. It was too vast, too diverse and too dependent on the personal authority of strong rulers to endure. Without a unifying great Khan, the khanates drifted apart, consumed by local struggles and weakened by the devastating pandemics and economic shifts of the 14th century. By the dawn of the 15th century, the Mongol Empire was gone, replaced by new powers that built upon its legacy but moved in their own directions. In China, the Ming dynasty asserted native rule. In Persia and Central Asia, Islamic dynasties rose from the ruins of Mongol states. In Russia, the memory of Mongol domination gave way to the rise of Muscovy. The Mongols themselves returned to the steppes, their days of empire a memory, but their influence written into the story of civilizations across continents. The rise and fall of the Mongol Empire is one of history's greatest dramas, a story of ambition, conquest, innovation and decline. From the unlikely rise of a boy named Temüjin to the creation of the largest land empire the world has ever known, and from its dazzling peak under Kublai Khan to its fragmentation and collapse, the Mongols reshaped the medieval world in ways still felt today. Thank you for watching History Recapped. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the turning points of human history. This has been History Recapped, where we bring the past back to life, one story at a time.